Good evening, and thank you all for coming to the 9th installment of the O.P. Jindal Distinguished Lectures. I'm Ashutosh Varshney, Director of the Center for Contemporary South Asia, and a professor here at the Watson Institute in Political Science. Let me start with a word about the genesis of these lectures. Sajjan and Sangeeta Jindal, Brown Parents 2012, have endowed these lectures in perpetuity in memory of Mr. O.P. Jindal, Sajjan's deceased father. The purpose of the endowment is to promote a discussion of the politics, economics, society, culture of modern India here at Brown. These lectures are held once every semester. The previous lecturers include Kaushik Basu, an economist until recently at the World Bank, whose book based on his Jindal lectures was published by MIT Press last fall. The other Jindal lecturers include Ram Guha, a historian, Ashish Nandi, a political psychologist, William Dalrymple, a literary figure and founder of the Jaipur Literary Festival, Montek Ahluwalia, a principal architect of India's post-91 economic reforms, and Salman Khurshid, India's former external affairs minister and a leading Muslim intellectual in India. Let me now introduce our speaker. In a well-known essay, Jeremy Waldron, leading political theorist of our times, has described the field of political theory as consisting of two domains that rarely interact. One domain is political philosophy, in which scholars have engaged questions of freedom, justice, equality, dignity, etc. The other domain he calls political theory. That's also the title of his Harvard University Press book out two months ago. So the other domain, according to Waldron, is political theory, which is about not human values per se, but about constitutions and political institutions. Pratap Mehta, our speaker today and on Friday, has worked in both of these domains. These domains actually have interacted in his work. The topic he's chosen for his Jindal lectures, the Nietzschean moment in India's intellectual history, and the focus on Iqbal today and Aurobindo on Friday, is likely to be quite firmly lodged in the first domain, the domain of political philosophy. Pratap was educated at Oxford, where he earned a bachelor's degree in politics, philosophy, and economics, PPE, and at Princeton, where he secured a PhD in political science. He started his teaching career at Harvard, where we were colleagues for some years in the 1990s. He returned to India a decade and a half ago, and after a brief association with JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, as a professor, he moved to the Center for Policy Research, CPR, which he has led and turned into one of the nation's most highly regarded institution for policy-relevant research. His books include The Burden of Democracy, which innovatively applies Tocqueville's insights about inequality to the relationship between caste and democracy in India. His honors include the prestigious Infosys Prize in 2011 and the Amartya Sen Award for the Social Sciences in 2013. It is with great pleasure, appreciation, and gratitude that I welcome Pratap once again to Brown. He's been a visitor. He will speak for 45 to 50 minutes. We will then have two commentaries of 10 to 15 minutes each, and I'll introduce the commentators later. Please join me in welcoming Pratap Bhanu Mehta. The topic is The Melody of Discord, Self and History in Iqbal.
Thank you, Ashu, as always, for a very generous introduction. It's wonderful being at Brown again. It almost feels like a second home these days, thanks to the generosity of this institution. And I'd also, I think, like to particularly, I think, thank the organizers of this lecture in Ashu for indulging me a little bit. What I'm about to do today is a somewhat amateurish exploration. My day job these days is more bureaucratic and administrative, although I do try and retire with the ancients at night. And in the course of those engagements, a couple of interesting new angles of inquiry opened up for me in terms of thinking about 19th and 20th century Indian intellectual history. I won't go into the details of what kind of larger project this is part of, but suffice it to say, I was struck by, in a sense, not just the extraordinary richness of that intellectual history, which goes without saying, but the ways in which I think the recent historiography of that period has, in a sense, abridged and I think mutilated that history in ways that I found actually quite surprising. Part of it is kind of understandable. I think the frames we have brought to bear upon the interpretation of figures like Iqbal and Aurobindo often, as it were, track our political interests, or you might say our practical interests of the moment. Were they nationalists? What was the refutation of Marxism, if anything? And in some senses, I think it's kind of obscured the layers and depths with which they were actually engaged in global currents of thought. And what I hope to do today and on Friday is just offer a very brief glimpse into that. I will not be able to do justice to the richness of Iqbal or Aurobindo. You need a whole course to actually get through their thought in all its kind of grandeur and complexity. But I do want to pick up on one problematic that I've identified as, in a sense, the Nietzschean moment. And I will explain what I mean by the Nietzschean moment as the lecture progresses. Hopefully by the end of the lecture, at least it'll be clear. But to me, it was actually a big surprise that much of what they wrote and said operated within the horizons of, I think, a problematic that Nietzsche bequeathed to us. And what I want to meditate upon is, in a sense, the uses, or you might say the uses and abuses, to which they actually put Nietzsche in their own work. And through that, open up, in a sense, a new kind of inquiry about Indian intellectual history. So Iqbal, at one point in his work, writes this: in modern Europe, Nietzsche, whose life and activity form, at least to us Easterns, an exceedingly interesting problem in religious psychology, was endowed with some sort of a constitutional equipment for such an undertaking. Undertaking meaning undertaking, thinking on behalf of freedom. His mental history is not without a parallel in Eastern thought. That a really imperative vision of the divine in man did come to him cannot be denied. I call his vision imperative because it appears to have given him a kind of prophetic mentality, which by some kind of technique aims at turning its vision into permanent life forces. Yet Nietzsche was a failure, and his failure was mainly due to his intellectual progenitors, such as Schopenhauer, Darwin, and Lang, whose influence blinded him to the real significance of his vision. Instead of looking for a spiritual rule, which would develop the divine even in a plebeian, and thus open up before him an infinite future, Nietzsche was driven to seek the realization of his vision in such schemes as aristocratic radicalism. What I propose to do in this lecture is talk about the sense in which Iqbal thought Nietzsche was prophetic and the sense in which he thought Nietzsche was a failure. Now, the answer to this question doesn't turn out to be simple, both methodologically and kind of interpretively, because one flippant answer, if you ask the question, what was the nature of Nietzsche's failure that Iqbal is alluding to in this passage, beyond the fact that Nietzsche's thought ends up in a kind of aristocratic radicalism? One answer Iqbal gives frequently through his career is a somewhat kind of flippant and amusing answer, which is, He basically says Nietzsche was somebody who deserved saving, was in the need of being saved, and actually if only he had met Iqbal, Iqbal could have saved him. In one of his poems, Asrar-e Khudi, he says, if that Frankish sage were present in this age, him Iqbal would teach God's high place and reach. Right? At another place, he writes rather poignantly in Religious Reconstruction, in his book Religious Reconstruction of Islamic Thought, Nietzsche was a failed genius whose vision was solely determined by his internal forces and remained unproductive for want of an expert external guidance in his spiritual life. And the irony of the fate is that this man, who appeared to all his friends as, quote, as if he had come from a country where no man had lived, was also fully conscious of his greatest spiritual need. He says, Nietzsche wrote, I confront alone an immense problem. It is as if I'm lost in a forest, a primeval one. I need help, I need disciples, but moreover, I need a master. So perhaps in offering to save Nietzsche, Iqbal was reciprocating, and this is my argument in a sense today, the sense in which Nietzsche might have actually saved him. Right? And this talk is in a sense about this kind of mutual symbiotic need to save each other. Iqbal saving Nietzsche from himself and Nietzsche saving Iqbal from himself in turn. Right? Now, the attraction of Nietzsche to Indian thinkers, and I think there were three in particular who did engage with Nietzsche, I think, the most deeply. Anand Kumaraswamy was one, although I think in retrospect, I don't find him that interesting. But Aurobindo and Iqbal, and Iqbal's engagement with Nietzsche is the most extensive because not only do you have the most references, not just scattered throughout his philosophical text, but all through Iqbal's poetry, you have unpublished notes, you have incredible correspondence that directly deals with Nietzsche. I think in Aurobindo's case, the references are a bit more elliptical, and we'll talk about them on Friday. Now, at one level, it's not hard to see the attraction that Nietzsche actually posed to somebody writing in late 19th, early 20th century India. For as we all know, to descend into the world of Nietzsche, or ascend, depending on your point of view, whose writing is psychologically acute, witty, profound, at once aphoristic and systematic, both deeply intimate and deeply prophetic, is to be subject to a big therapeutic jolt. The abiding fascination with his thinking comes, and I think on this Aurobindo and Iqbal are united, from the fact that he operates at so many levels simultaneously. Principally, he had exposed the crisis of Western reason from within, hitting every single one of the central metaphysical balls, so to speak, out of the ballpark. Reason? That's not a necessary operation of the mind itself, but has a contingent history. The indubitable I is not a coherent, stable subject, but an amalgam of contradictory drives. Morality, it turns out, was not the solution it was touted to be to human problems. It rested on a false view of agency. It impeded genuine ethical reflection. It circumscribed human greatness and presented a set of contingent values as unconditioned, universal, and independent of us. Even worse, at least in its Christian variant, it was a repressive system that deformed life itself. Civilization, you might say? That's also a repressive inversion. Rather than asking what is good for human beings, civilization asks what are human beings good for. It thoroughly instrumentalizes us. Equality and democracy in their current form did not represent new liberation. Rather, the demands for justification they raised militated against self-legislation and creativity. Human nature was not the relatively placid, fixed artifact that perhaps thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment had imagined. It was itself products of layers of historical sentiment whose depths we barely understood. Conscience is not the divine form of reason, but a form of hatred discharged internally. So what's not to like about Nietzsche, right? Apart from the psychologically, I think, acute nature of many of these observations, the appeal of Nietzsche to people like Aurobindo and Iqbal was clear, because most principally what they did was they exposed the false universality under which colonialism had set up hierarchies of thought, right? Colonialism could not be represented as a force of liberation, but as a manifestation that was itself, but a manifestation of the crisis that was at the heart of civilization itself. And Nietzsche was an interesting way into entering what the crisis of that civilization represented. Right? Now, interpreting Iqbal's relationship with Nietzsche is a very fraught task hermeneutically, and I do want to kind of gesture at that because I won't have time to go into the detail. Allusions to Nietzsche's work abound in his texts, philosophical texts, in his poetry, in his vast corpus of extraordinary poetry, even in his poetic metaphors. And it is often tempting to sort of demonstrate the affinities between Iqbal's idea of a perfect man and Nietzsche's idea of a Superman. In fact, there's a vast cottage industry devoted to doing that right from the moment that Iqbal began to publish his works. The first published edition of his magnum opus of poetry, Asrar-e-Khudi, the Cambridge translator, our Professor Nicholson, actually, the introduction to that basically presented Asrar-e-Khudi as a kind of articulation of Nietzschean themes in sort of Eastern poetry. And Iqbal wrote an extensive essay trying to actually correct that misunderstanding, and in the process trying to distance itself from Nietzsche. And Iqbal's protest against being identified too closely with Nietzsche, even though in some senses the poetry was replete with Nietzschean themes, had a very familiar ring to it. Iqbal protested to Nicholson that actually there's the simple matter that my conception of the self or the perfect man was developed before I encountered Nietzsche, perhaps as early as 1902. It draws on ideas implicit in Islamic philosophy, particularly conception of Sufism. Nietzsche's conception of thought is aristocratic. I am a democrat. Nietzsche's Superman is solipsistically antisocial, whereas mine can find perfection only in a community of like-minded beings governed by a shared ideal. Nietzsche's Superman is beyond law, denies the existence of a stable I, whereas I believe that the self is, in some senses, an authentic center of experience. Nietzsche's Superman is materialistic, whereas I want to recast human freedom in terms of divine providence. Nietzsche's Superman was premised upon the rejection of theism, whereas I am interested in some senses furthering the ideals of Islam as I understand it. So at one level, it might seem like a sort of pretty odd task to say, well, what then is Iqbal's debt to Nietzsche, if this is the kind of the degree of his disavowal, right? There is a thorny question whether this disavowal is more a gesture than a matter of kind of sincerity on Iqbal's part, right? And what I want to claim in this lecture is that there is a hint of a lot more going on. In fact, the disavowal almost has a sense of thou protested too much. You don't have to be a Straussian to see that undertone in Iqbal's thought. Iqbal described Nietzsche as one whose heart is of a believer, even though he's an infidel. And you might argue equally, in an appropriately Nietzschean way, that Iqbal's heart had something of a Nietzschean infidel in him, even though he described himself as a believer consistently. And that's the play, in a sense, I want to work on. The one obvious attraction, as I said, Nietzsche had for Iqbal, apart from the fact that Nietzsche had exposed the crisis of Western reason from within, was that Nietzsche represented, I think as Bhrigupati Singh and various other people have written, a kind of extraordinary circulation of perfectionist thought in the late 19th and early 20th century, a line that runs kind of from Emerson to Nietzsche, Whitman, Iqbal, completing that full circle. Iqbal had once written that he had hoped to write an extensive book on Muslim thought to show the student of Western philosophy how, quote, philosophic thinking made the whole world kin. And standard to Iqbal's kind of interpretation of this aspiration was that a post-theistic world would not lead to nihilism. Rather, it would liberate the potentiality in the human that the incrustation of metaphysics and theism had suppressed. The death of God that Nietzsche announced in a Christian sense was not the equivalent of a meaningless world. The idea of personality that Nietzsche espoused following Emerson and so forth could itself become the standard of value. So there is kind of that framing of, a problematic in terms of a global conception. But for a moment, I mean, let's dig a little bit deeper into this, the sense in which Nietzsche is a believer and Iqbal an infidel. It is almost as if you get the impression sometimes that Iqbal was using Muhammad's authority, the Quranic injunction which says, create in yourself the attributes of God, to actually underwrite Nietzsche's injunction, fellow creators, the creator seeketh. Right? Remember Nietzsche's passage in the Zarathustra, companion, the creator seeks not corpses, fellow creators, the creator seeks, right? The prophet for Iqbal, Prophet Muhammad, was a singular figure who had experienced the incandescent luminosity of the mystic. But unlike the mystic, the prophet chose to return and insert himself into the sweep of history and create a world of new ideals. But genuine freedom, Iqbal wrote, could flower only when prophets were no longer imminent. Iqbal writes, quote, life cannot forever be kept in leading strings, that in order to achieve full self-consciousness, man must finally be thrown back upon his own resources. Right? It is for this reason that Iqbal also saw himself, like Nietzsche, as a relentless slayer of false prophets and of any expectation of false prophecy in the future. Just as an aside, the brunt of his slaying of all kinds of false prophets, both in a literal and metaphorical sense, often fell on the Ahmadiyya community. It's still an ongoing struggle in Pakistan. The barriers of the Magian crust over Islam, who were constantly looking forward to new prophetic forms in the form of Zoroaster's unborn sons. And I'll return to this point in a sense later. But the point I want to emphasize is that although Iqbal consistently said that what he was doing was, in a sense, interpreting the Quran, there is something very peculiar in his kind of construction about the figure of the prophet and what that figure actually represents to us. It has more of that Nietzschean sense of self-creation rather than the prophet, in a sense, as a guide and the guarantor of the future. I'm not competent to go into kind of Iqbal's Quranic exegesis. But what I do want to claim, that apart from this construction of the prophet as a creator, there are three distinctive ways in which Nietzschean themes run through Iqbal's text. Three ruptures that are caused by, in his own work, by Iqbal's reading of Nietzsche. The first is a historiographical rupture, the second an ontological rupture, and the third a political one. And I'll briefly touch upon all three of these. So first, to the historiographical rupture. There is an interesting puzzle in Iqbal's work and in Iqbal's scholarship that has to do with, in a sense, the subtle shift in Iqbal's own position and reading of Sufi metaphysics. Right? In his PhD dissertation, which was written in Germany, called The History of Metaphysics in Persia, Iqbal had argued with a certain degree of regret about the inadequacy of Persian metaphysics as a system. Right? It had not, he argued, represented in systematically developed rational system of thought the kind of mystical equivalents that you actually had in Hinduism or Neo-Vedantism. Right? And in that book, particularly the History of Metaphysics in Persia, there's almost a kind of touch of regret about this fact. The fact that Islamic metaphysics is, in a sense, not developed to its kind of fully rational form that can be apprehended in thought. As you move to Iqbal's later works, particularly Asrar-e-Khudi, he seems to shift to a very different yardstick by which he judges metaphysics. And the yardstick now becomes not metaphysics' ability to comprehend the structure of reality or truth as he sees it, but the way in which metaphysics performs certain psychological needs, right? And he argues in some ways, right, that the deficiency of Islamic metaphysics at a certain point was not that it had not developed into a fully rational system of thought, but that it actually represented a system of, as it were, psychologically weakness, of psychological weakness, right? Iqbal began to argue that whatever remnants of a metaphysical turn that you actually see in Islam, particularly medieval Islamic Sufi thought, enfeebled Islam because, again, not because it was not a rationally developed system of metaphysics, but because it no longer valued the kind of personality that could put their creative stamp on history, right? In some senses, Islamic metaphysics had come to devalue the creative side of the Prophet itself. As Naveda Khaneraz has argued in a brilliant book, in Iqbal's construction of the Prophet Muhammad as a figure, the Prophet is available to every Muslim in many possibilities as one's next self after this one and so on, right? And the charge that he levels against Islamic metaphysics is that, in a sense, it has actually obscured this truth about the Prophet. He says, this is the time we need creators of value who can put their stamp on history, not the contemplator of eternal verities. And he has this refrain on many occasions. I mean, you can go kind of citation by citation, right? Where he says that his critique of all other religious systems now is not that they are wrong or undeveloped in some objective sense. It is that they are weak. As he wrote to his translator Nicholson in 1915, Buddhism, Persian Sufism, and all allied forms of ethics will not serve our purpose, right? Why will they not serve our purpose? Because they do not, in a sense, produce healthy instincts. He even goes so far in Asrar-e-Khudi, in a very Nietzschean thought, right, to actually argue that all projections of paradise that come out of, in a sense, Islamic thinking are now symptoms of, in a sense, a certain kind of psychological weakness. Paradise is for the weak alone. Strength is but the means of perdition. It is wickedness to seek greatness and glory. Penury is sweeter than princedom. O thou that taketh delight in the slaughter of sheep, slay thyself, and thou wilt have honor. So what you find all of a sudden in, I think, Iqbal's work is an incredible revaluation of the value of metaphysics itself. And the blame he places squarely, following Nietzsche's footsteps, on Plato. Iqbal wrote about Plato that ancient and ascetic sage was one of the ancient flock of sheep. He could not endure the noise of this world, and he set his heart on the glow of a quenched flame. But it's the metaphysical speculation that was inspired by the Greeks that had led to the degrading of the sensory world. And he thinks Islam had fallen into the same trap that, in a sense, Christian and metaphysics had by following Plato. The search for pure concepts, which metaphysical systems yearned for, devalued nature and history. Plato's speculations had led him to conclude that the visible world was unreal, a mere play of shadows. In the Platonic view, only ideas were eternal and permanent, and therefore a grasp of the flux of reality eluded it. Plato produced metaphysics that made concepts falsely timeless, stable and definite, in ways that obscured the flow of experience. And in a radical historiographical move, Iqbal argues, normally kind of Islamic philosophy was credited with preserving Greek philosophy. He argues it was Greek philosophy that poisoned and oriented Islam away from the empirical, right? Now, part of this was the idea of kind of his explanation for why, in a sense, after that initial flowering of science in Islam, had science fallen by the wayside, and he attributed to the baneful influence of Platonic metaphysics, right? If the modern subject was to be restored to vitality, it had to be purged of all traces of metaphysical influence. The baneful effect of the search for eternal concepts uncontaminated by sensory reality, right, for Iqbal was underscored by the experience canonically of Hindu philosophical systems, who also exhibited the same Platonic flight into unreality. What all of them had in common was they abnegated life on behalf of knowledge, rather than pressing knowledge in the service of life. And in one historiographical stroke, Iqbal does the same operation on Sufi metaphysics as Nietzsche had basically done on Platonism's influence on Western culture. Iqbal firmly believed in the experiential reality that the Sufis were referring to, but he consistently insisted, right, that metaphysics no longer represented any sets of objective truths. They should be judged by the yardstick and the needs and demands of sort of personality. Right? So that's kind of one sort of historical rupture about the effacement of sort of metaphysics. The second rupture that happens, again, shift in Iqbal's own work at this time, is captured by a letter MacTaggart, who was his teacher at Cambridge, writes to Iqbal after the publication of Israr-e-Khudi. And in that letter, MacTaggart writes to Iqbal, he said, "I'm writing to tell you with how much pleasure I've been reading your poems. Have you not changed your position very much? Surely in the days we used to talk philosophy together, you were much more of a pantheistic and a mystic," right? So MacTaggart's claim, and Iqbal always kind of recirculates this letter with approval, was that Iqbal had in some senses ontologically moved away from both pantheism and mysticism. And in some ways, I think this characterization is accurate, because at some point Iqbal begins to argue that pantheism bequeaths a problem, which is that it effaces individuality, and mysticism bequeaths a problem because what it does is it reinstates the dualism, in a sense, of the world. It was, I would argue, actually post his encounter with Nietzsche, that in a sense the shift away from mysticism and pantheism became actually central to his philosophical thinking. He actually finds, in a sense, a parallel philosophical problematic, for example, in the context between idealism and empiricism in British Hegelian thought, where he basically argues that, again, in his correspondence with MacTaggart, that empiricism is particularism without coherence, and idealism is coherence without any particulars. Right? So for Iqbal, in a sense, and I'll bracket kind of the epistemological contest between idealism and empiricism that Iqbal sort of talks about. But the one central point that he actually takes away, or at least comes through in his engagement with MacTaggart, and a rather powerful essay he wrote on MacTaggart's powerfully, was the following. He said, "I'm with MacTaggart in my insistence that, quote, the differentiation of the universe into different selves cannot be regarded as a mere illusion." Iqbal wrote, quote, "The absolute, according to him, further differentiates itself into concrete egos. The universe is not an illusion," which is the mystical position in some ways. "It is a system of real selves which cannot be regarded as mere predicates or adjectives of the absolute." Right? Now, quite what Iqbal means by the idea that there is a real self that is not simply an adjective of the absolute, right? It's not quite clear, but you can in a sense see, right, in it the germ of his, again, revolt against metaphysical absorption of the self in something larger than the absolute, where its individuality would be effaced. In Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, he argues, again in a Nietzschean vein, that a striving self should not be replaced by a self that is absorbed in the infinite. The self is characterized fundamentally by individuality, privacy, uniqueness, and creativity. It cannot be subordinated to something larger. The self is individual in the sense that it is an independent locus of thought and action, right? That no metaphysics can in any ways erase, right? So the ontological shift that Iqbal makes from, in a sense, an interest in pantheism and mysticism, right? Two expressions, in a sense, of the absolute, is, in a sense, deepened now, or at least that shift is deepened by this recourse to the idea of a self that is essentially creative, overcoming its own past through striving and action. In fact, his revolt against life-denying contemplating metaphysics leads him to suggest, in an almost Nietzschean way, that existence is expression in action. Right? Now you might say, okay, so you don't want the effacing of this individual locus of experience under the guise of an absolute, or to regard them as mere adjectives in service of an absolute. How do you then reconcile that with your claim to being an Islamic thinker in some ways, right? Because Iqbal also has this interest in the authentic religious experience and infinite. And this is where I think Iqbal makes possibly his most interesting philosophical move, where he argues that the existence of a finite ego, a locus of independent creativity and striving, can be reconciled with the experience of the infinite, right? If we simply do away with the metaphor of absorption, he writes, can the finite ego as such retain its finitude besides the infinite absolute? This difficulty is based on the misunderstanding of the true nature of the infinite. True infinity does not mean infinite extension, which cannot be conceived without embracing all finite extensions. Its nature rather consists in intensity, not extensity. And the moment we fix our gaze on intensity, we begin to see the finite ego, right, must be distinct, though not isolated from the infinite, right? I mean, it's a very kind of striking re-articulation, right, of the religious experience in terms of the experience of the self reaching infinity in the moment of intensity, rather than, in a sense, through the exercise of absorption. And again, given that historical tradition, it's a very novel move. Nietzsche had famously argued, or described, man as passing through three stages, and it was man in his case. The camel, a stage of obedience; the lion, a stage which is a stage of self-determination and self-control. And in the third stage, Nietzsche reverts to the image of a child, an innocent and forgetful child, perhaps the ultimate model of self-legislation, not even encumbered by memory and therefore capable of creating new values. As Nietzsche wrote, the child is innocence and forgetfulness, a new beginning, a sport, a self-propelling wheel, a first motion, a sacred yes. Yes, a sacred yes is needed, my brothers, for the sport of creation. The spirit now wills its own will. The spirit sundered from the world now wills its own world. Iqbal, in a kind of interesting sort of gloss on Nietzsche's three metamorphoses, changes the final kind of conclusion or denouement of the three stages. In the third stage, he replaces the child with what he calls the divine vice-regent. In his notes on Nietzsche, he argues that Nietzsche's recourse to the metaphor of the child in the third stage was indicative of his ultimate inability to escape materialism. He could, in the end, despite all its liberatory potential, only toy with a biological image, one that abstracted from our experience and our embodiments in society and history, right? Like Nietzsche's child, Iqbal argued, the divine vice-regent is the creator of values. Of course, remember, the most perfect example of a divine vice-regent is Muhammad, right? Who remains an example available to us all. But the creativity of the vice-regent is not born out of innocence, but out of experience, as it were. It is not a creativity born out of forgetting, that's how Iqbal reading sort of Nietzsche, nor is it sundered from the world, right? An idea that Iqbal thought in the end condemned Nietzsche to the same escapism that mystics had been condemned to. It is rather based on an opposite. The creativity of the vice-regent is based on the opposite. Not a forgetfulness, but a realization of the way in which we carry the imprint of past time. For Iqbal, taqdeer, right, the Islamic concept, which Quran describes as destiny, is not predetermination. It is rather the claim that time is an organic whole in which the past is not left behind, but is moving along with and operating, in a sense, in the present. As Iqbal put it in his essay on Mehta, the serious thing that happened to poor Nietzsche, whose peculiar intellectual environment led him to think that his vision of ultimate ego could be realized in a world of space and time. Right? In a sense, what Iqbal offered as a substitute is a new conception of time, and I think it's worth thinking about, perhaps in discussion, what the distinction between this and Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence is. But fundamentally, that Nietzsche, having recognized the stages in the metamorphosis, had no conceptual tools to think outside of, as it were, existing notions of space and time. I finally want to end briefly with the third rupture and then sort of bring this to a close, which is the political one. So there's the historiographical one about how do you write the history of metaphysics by importing a new psychological standard, right, to judge its adequacy in terms of its contribution to the development of personality. A new kind of ontological rupture which wants to preserve the distinctiveness of the individual self, right, and its absorption into any purpose larger than or outside of itself, right? The self is not adjectival to the absolute or the whole, right? It's a very sort of radical idea. And the third place where there is a kind of Nietzschean undercurrent running through Iqbal is, of course, in Iqbal's characterization of the current predicament. The relationship between action and history for Iqbal should remain an open one. The defining hallmark of freedom is precisely that there is no guarantee that the world will take up your actions in the way you intend. He was averse to the idea, in a strange way, that history is the progressive realization of the absolute whose freedom finds full expression and self-consciousness through the objective institutions of society. Right? Iqbal, as a student of Mehta, knew his Hegel well, but the Hegelian resolution of the problem, in a sense, of the relationship between idealism and history, or in more ontological terms, the relationship between the transcendent and immanent, was not available to him, largely thanks to, I think, a post-Nietzschean metaphysics. It was also not available to Iqbal for the straightforward reason that the very institutions that Hegel had described as representing the absolute's march to self-consciousness, right? So that, in a sense, history itself generates the kind of reconciliation that is required. The modern state, for example, were also seen by Iqbal as inimical rather than productive of a genuine ethical life. So for a thinker like Iqbal, with his historical experience, it was difficult to imagine the institutions of Western modernity as being the agents of liberation, pure and simple, let alone as expression of absolute God's will, right? Now, Iqbal's own preferred political solution, which we don't have time to go into, it's a kind of thorny question of what kind of political community Iqbal had in mind. But there is no question that in the backdrop of what he thought was, in a sense, the crisis of culture that any modern political institutions had to resolve to, was very Nietzschean in its articulation. He says, for example, modern man has ceased to live soulfully, that is from within. Thus, wholly overshadowed by the results of his intellectual activity, modern man has ceased to live soulfully from within. In the domain of thought, he is living in open conflict with himself. In the domain of economic and political life, he's living in open conflict with others. He finds himself unable to control his ruthless egoism and his infinite gold hunger, which is gradually killing all higher striving in him and bringing him nothing but life weariness. Right? And he sort of goes on, and then he says, the technique of medieval mysticism by which religious life, in its higher manifestations, developed itself both in the East and West, has now practically failed. Right? And in the Muslim East, it has perhaps done far greater havoc than anywhere else. For far from reintegrating the forces of the average man's inner life and preparing himself in the march of history and perfection, it has taught him a false renunciation and made him perfectly content with his ignorance and spiritual thraldom. Right? So, I mean, this is kind of the shared common ground in the characterization of, in a sense, of the crisis of culture. Right? Moreover, like Nietzsche, Iqbal, I think, was convinced that most modern political ideologies did not offer a solution to this predicament. Socialism, nationalism, democracy all fail the test of personality, right? And it's a figure he invokes again. And the arguments are straightforwardly Nietzschean. I mean, there's no, right? But I just want to end with, I think, to make this kind of sense of crisis more complete, is how these strands come together in Iqbal's politics. By referring to a controversial subject in his career, which is Iqbal's views of Ahmadiyas, right? Which is a sect, or it's a debate whether it's a sect of Islam or not. It's been declared a heresy, which I think brings out what's at stake in his diagnosis. On the subject of Ahmadiyas, Iqbal had a fascinating and remarkable exchange with Jawaharlal Nehru. And this is not the occasion to discuss the full political consequences of Iqbal's view on Ahmadiyas, which are still tragically playing out in contemporary Pakistan. But what is, I think, of some interest is I think, the conceptual moves he makes in discussing the Ahmadiyya sort of problem. In his essay on the Ahmadiyas, at one level, he begins with a very resounding defense of the idea of toleration. In fact, he begins by rejecting kind of the Gibbonian conception of toleration. Faisal Devji has written about this. And he argues that what we need is a spiritually powerful form of toleration. He says it's obvious that most forms of these types of toleration have no ethical value. On the other hand, most forms of toleration reveal the spiritual impoverishment of the man who practices them. True toleration is begotten of intellectual breadth and spiritual expansion. It is the toleration of the spiritually powerful man who, while jealous of the frontiers of his own faith, can tolerate and even appreciate all forms of faith other than his own. Of this type of toleration, the true Muslim alone is capable. His own faith is synthetic, and for this reason, he can find grounds of sympathy and appreciation in other faiths. And then he goes on, only a true lover of God can appreciate the value of devotion, even though it is directed to gods in which he himself does not believe. Now, this remarkable passage is often taken as a statement of Iqbal's deep and extraordinary form of toleration. It's a toleration based on the rejection of weakness and necessity and indifference, right? There is something deeply attractive about this passage, where toleration is premised on recognizing oneself in the other, as it were. The same striving, even though it is devoted to other gods. An affirmation of another's devotion is, in this sense, an affirmation of the quality of one's own devotion. Toleration has to come from a position of strength, right? Though here the reference to, in a sense, is inner strength. And this is not a kind of standard liberal conception of toleration, a pluralistic conception of toleration. So this is one kind of, passage in Iqbal. But the same essay, more notoriously and tragically, went on to argue against the Ahmadiyas. Part of the argument was based on the argument that the Ahmadiyas posed a political threat to the project of a Muslim community. Part of it was based on the claim that the Ahmadiyas, by arguing that another prophet was about to come, was in a sense denigrating the value of Prophet Muhammad, and therefore were to be classed as heretics in terms of traditional doctrine of heresy. But most significantly, he argues Islam will not tolerate any revival of medieval mysticism which has robbed its followers of their healthy instincts and given them only obscure thinking in return. Right? What this passage reflects is not just the concern about the health of Islam as a political community. The point about medieval mysticism is also not that it will bring Islam back to social orthodoxy, which is a whole other debate. It is that the utility of this doctrine has to be judged by the personality type it creates, right? And it has to be judged for the purposes it serves for life. There is more than a hint in Iqbal's construction of the Ahmadiyya that what was wrong with them was not the fact that they were yearning for a prophet, but what was wrong with them was that this was a sign of weakness, a kind of longing for a contemptible longing for a kind of tutelage, right? That a personality seeking vitality in life, right, should have been able to overcome. Right? In short, right, and this is the point I want to make about his argument, is that the persecution of the Ahmadiyya was not just, in a sense, a political project, right? In a sense, they become the figure, right? Or that community that actually, in a sense, embodies the very weakness that Iqbal thinks a creative life force, in a sense, has to overcome. And it's not accidental, not for the first time in the history of thought, right, that an extraordinarily liberatory idea, right, ends up finding its target on the contempt expressed for a particular community. So it should be apparent by now that what I refer to as Iqbal's Nietzschean moment has the following elements. And for Indian intellectual history, these were pivotal moments. The diagnosis that culture and its major institutions were in crisis and had lost all the inner motivations that animated them. The radical historiographical claim that metaphysics serves the need of moral psychology and can often disfigure it and can be judged by those yardsticks. Right? It's already a very heretical claim because it wants to, in a sense, reclaim ontology within the needs of the social and the psychological. The parallel historical claim that the influence of Greek metaphysics diminished the possibilities of creative traditions, including Islam. The idea that personality was the standard of value and in some sense beyond good and evil. The criteria of judgment is the type of personality produced. In that sense, traditional conceptions of right and wrong, or even the problem of evil, is irrelevant to ethics. The end of metaphysics and a post-theistic world would open up the possibilities of seeing human beings as fundamentally creators of value, with an ability to order the world by the force of their own personality. These values were not inscribed in the objective order of the universe, to be grasped intellectually, right, but in a sense to be created from the self, from within. The refusal, in Nietzschean terms, of historical teleology and the comforts of kind of Hegelian idealism, and a kind of acceptance of the ethical irrationality of the world. And yet, right, the hope that all of the above did not amount to a new kind of nihilism, but opened up the possibility of a new form of perfection. Right? In that sense, right, I hope you can see the sense in which there is too much of the infidel in Iqbal, as I had suggested. But perhaps in this radical rupture, and this really is a radical rupture. I mean, I don't think Indian intellectual history kind of recovers after this. The functional use of metaphysics, all of this becomes sort of commonplace, right? Where Iqbal, on the one hand, thought what he could do is abolish all dualisms, the epistemic dualism between a mystical form of knowledge and other forms of knowledge, an ontological dualism between the infinite that exists independently of us and our individual selves, and a political dualism between the secular and the sacred. Right? This very radical project perhaps could have used, one bit of Nietzschean warning that if you actually unleash the inner ocean of the self, you're not quite sure whether what will emerge out of it is God or Titan. Right? And we'll see how that problem plagues Aurobindo next week.
Our first commentator is Bernard Reginster. Do you want to go first? No, you can decide.
I don't prefer.
You don't have a preference?
No, I don't.
Okay. Bhrigu, you want to go? Okay. So our first commentator is Bhrigupati Singh, Assistant Professor of Anthropology here at Brown and a Faculty Fellow at the Watson Institute. He has published widely on issues of religion, politics, media, and popular culture in journals including Cultural Anthropology, American Ethnologies, Contributions to Indian Sociology. His recent book, Poverty and the Quest for Life, Spiritual and Material Striving in Contemporary Rural India, was published by University of Chicago Press in 2015 and received several awards. He's co-editor of an edited volume which has been widely read, the title is The Ground Between Anthropological Engagements with Philosophy, published by Duke University Press in 2014. I can say more, but let's hear him. Sure, yeah.
Good evening, and thanks, Pratap. Thank you for the incredible philosophical labor of this paper, in addition to so much that you already do in India to keep democratic thought and intellectual life alive. I am an anthropologist who only occasionally writes essays that could be called philosophy, although the lines are disputed between which discipline ends and where the other one begins. But as a result, I love Pratap's image of going to sleep with the ancients, because philosophy was always meant to be an erotic relation, a secret love affair that you have that makes the rest of your life look interesting. So thank you for that image, which I wouldn't say is a dilettante. It's what philosophy was meant to be, I think. So to begin, one of the questions that concerns us quite deeply here at the Center for Contemporary South Asia at Brown is this: what is the meaning of the term contemporary? How far back does it go, and how far ahead do we dare to look if we don't just assume an impoverished notion of the present? Pratap, as we know, is best known as one of the foremost commentators on current events in South Asia. What currents might we sense in his talk today? Are these events still ongoing, or is it just intellectual history of the past that is at stake here? Maybe there's a different horizon of time that we must be open to if we are to listen to a philosophical argument. And there is a labor of listening involved in philosophy, which is quite tough in a way. And because the horizon is different, it's easy to miss the events and the urgencies within this form of thought. So in my comments today, I want to do three things. The first is to situate what I see as the horizon and the urgency of the form of thought in which Pratap is engaged, slightly differently than just Indian intellectual history. Second, for those who are more distant from these particular philosophical regions, I want to emphasize the extent to which Pratap engages what in social science we would call alternative explanations offered by other recent authors, and his really kind of remarkable intervention he makes into a cluster of arguments, recent arguments on Iqbal. And lastly, I'll hope to offer what I see as a very crucial suggestion from within philosophy, which I hope will take the argument a step further. So first, the urgency. To cite a line from Pratap's introduction, what did colonialism reveal about the human condition? Are we still living in this condition? Or to phrase the question differently, how would thought proceed not from Midnight's children, but from its grandchildren, that is us, for whom philosophical thought, say from a non-Western context, cannot of course invent itself out of nothing. In my own work, I've tried to phrase this question somewhat cheekily by asking what comes after post-colonial theory. I see the intimations of an answer in the kind of work that very few people do, but thankfully one of them is with us in Brown, Leela Gandhi, whose books create a kind of world map through connections and affinities where the West and the so-called non-West are found not only through mutual negations. I see Pratap's engagement as doing something somewhat similar. Following my own favorite philosophers, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, I call this geophilosophy, a philosophy of the earth. I mention the French philosopher Deleuze not only because of my own preferences, but because for many who are interested in these issues, Deleuze is one of the finest 20th century readers of Nietzsche and Henri Bergson, the two Western philosophers closest to Iqbal. I'll return to Bergson in a minute, but meanwhile I want to emphasize the horizon of what some call, or what I would call the danger of such a term, but world philosophy, although such a term would be open to the same dangers as world religions or world literatures, but there is something at stake in that. In a way, because I emphasize this, because on the face of it, Pratap's concerns are quite distant from the preoccupations of most political theorists, the ones we are most familiar with, for example, concerns such as nations and nationalism, as with Partha Chatterjee, or caste, as with Gandhi-Ambedkar debates that are of a lot of significance at present, as well as the sort of well-wrought questions from Harvard, particularly of redistributive justice and so on, associated with philosophers like John Rawls and Amartya Sen, among others. So somewhat unexpectedly and possibly to his disadvantage, because people often don't get the significance of this kind of speculation, Pratap is preoccupied here with a basic question of philosophy, namely the ways in which metaphysics, or the horizon of the infinite, call it God, or Elan Vital, was a central concern for Iqbal, founding thinker of South Asia, and among others, and the ways in which this may, although it also may not, remain alive as a concern for us today. Do we still care about metaphysics, or is it something that is just a question of history? The invocation of the global should also make us wonder about territory and location. Iqbal is a thinker of where? Of Pakistan, of India, or of Islam, or of the world? What is his proper territory? And who has the right to speak about Iqbal? In philosophy, we earn such a right not by citizenship or religion, but by living with a thinker. Any great thinker has a territory, of course, but they also travel and exceed that territory. Thinkers can be lost by leaving them for too long to be ossified in a particular territory. Tagore, for instance, perhaps needs to be philosophically regained by wrenching him out of Bengal and Bengali cultural nationalism.
Yeah.
At the same time, territory is very, very important. It can't be defined simply by equations that Iqbal is Muslim, and nor, because then we'd miss the enormous reinterpretation that Iqbal offers of Islam, which we'll turn to in a second. Or another false equation, as Pratap clarifies, is just to spot comparative resemblances. For instance, to say that Iqbal's perfect, or better maybe perfectible human, Insan ul Kamil, is the same as Nietzsche's Superman, a resemblance that Iqbal himself, as we saw, disagreed with. Instead of resemblances, a territory might be defined by its arguments. Pratap departs from the three most significant arguments on Iqbal made by South Asian scholars in recent years, namely Aisha Jalal, Faisal Devji, and Navida Khan. To summarize these arguments in one sentence each, a liberty I feel I can take, because at least two of them, Devji and Khan, are very close friends of mine and long-standing interlocutors. So Devji, in short, argues that Iqbal remains a Sufi through and through because of his philosophical emphasis on the self. That's Devji. Very differently than Devji, Aisha Jalal presents Iqbal also as a founding thinker, but as a thinker of secularization, which she differentiates from secularism, arguing that his emphasis on the finality of prophethood, and thus Iqbal's famous intolerance of the Ahmadis in their opening up of the idea that prophecy could continue in the modern world, is an argument for a kind of self-sufficient individualism empowered with the right of ijtihad, that is rational interpretation, to question the actual instantiation of Quranic values. So that's Aisha Jalal. Differently from Aisha Jalal, Navida Khan argues that via Nietzsche and Bergson, Iqbal arrives at a question of what becoming might mean within Islam, or how newness might emerge within religion. Through very delicate ethnographic work, Navida Khan tries to show how the horizon of aspiration in contemporary Pakistan and some of its tragedies, as Pratap also hints, might be understood not through Jinnah or other founding figures, but through an Iqbalian lens. Departing from each of these three arguments, Pratap sets up a different philosophical antagonism that opens up Iqbal as a thinker of Islam, of course, but also of Hinduism and in a way for philosophy at large. The crux of Pratap's argument, as I see it, occurs in the second half of his paper when he says, and I quote, and sometimes maybe you can only get the seriousness of a philosophical argument when somebody else repeats it. So here's the crux. In truth, Iqbal had to do the same operation on Sufi metaphysics as Nietzsche had to do on Plato. Nietzsche's antagonism with Socrates and for Platonic metaphysics is reasonably well known. Here is Nietzsche in Ecce Homo, his philosophical autobiography. My readers know perhaps in what way I consider dialectics as a symptom of decadence. To summarize the antagonism in very short, according to Nietzsche, Socrates dissolved and finished what Nietzsche considered to be the highest achievement of Greek philosophy, a living agon between different ways of life. In the guise of an agon or a philosophical context, which is a contest, which is often the genre of the Socratic dialogue, we are led to so-called higher truths, the metaphysical form of the good. For Nietzsche, Socrates is not the philosophical hero that he's often presented as in undergraduate curriculums even today, but rather the end of Greek philosophy and the bridge towards Christian metaphysics. Iqbal's target, and here Nietzsche is a very useful ally, is the encounter between Islam and Islamic and Hellenistic thought, and specifically Islamic Neoplatonism, or the idea of another world as possessing a higher reality than this one. Islam is the discovery of this world, of the human, Iqbal argues. But then what to do with God? Close readers of Nietzsche also know that his famous God is dead statement in Gay Science is followed on the very next page by a much lesser known assertion equally important to Nietzsche's thought. He says, I would believe in a God who could dance. I myself have argued in 2 essays that Nietzsche is best understood as a Hindu philosopher, but that is an argument for another day. More importantly, here's the second crucial philosophical operation that Pratap performs on Iqbal. For Iqbal, God exists, but as the highest self, as the best instantiation of the striving self. We might recognize Pratap's reading of Iqbal as what philosophers like Heidegger or Deleuze have called a reversal of Platonism. But this reversal also opens Iqbal out to the world at large, since what he's creating, or attempting to create, according to Pratap, is an alternative to dualism and to monism, or at least a certain kind of Vedantic monism, which came to be the dominant version of Indian philosophy that is taught even today, with its emphasis on mere appearance as against the metaphysical reality of Brahman, or the so-called unity of Atman and Brahman. Iqbal himself very much had this impulse of crossing philosophical territories, even neighboring ones. His acclaimed Persian poem, Asrar-i-Khudi, which Pratap mentioned, called Secrets of the Self, is structured in part as sayings of Hindu rishis. But Iqbal disagrees with the rishis, or at least one dominant modern interpretation of Vedantic thought. And here is the disagreement, which is another crucial part of Pratap's philosophical claim on Iqbal. Aham is not Brahmasmi. The self resists being absorbed into something larger. It preserves and differentiates itself. And here begins the conflict, or the sort of missing philosophical elephant in the room. For me, Bergson, Henri Bergson, who was such a towering global presence in the 20th and the early 20th century that the first time he came to the United States, the then president of the US, Woodrow Wilson, personally went to the airport to pick him up. Such was the status of philosophy. Our best local guide for the relationship between Iqbal and Bergson is the philosopher Suleiman Bashir at Columbia University, who could also have been one of our discussants. In essays like Bergson in the Colony, Intuition and Duration in Senghor and Iqbal, or Achieving Humanity, Convergence between Bergson and Iqbal. In Iqbal's reconstruction of religious thought in Islam, first published in Lahore in 1930, perhaps the most cited philosophical text is Bergson's Creative Evolution, which was published in 1908. Suleiman Bashir has argued that it's also likely that Iqbal's recasting of mysticism in turn influenced Bergson's turn to mysticism in his last book, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, published in 1932. What would happen to Pratap's argument on Iqbal if we were to add Bergson to the picture? As a first step, I would say that Bergsonian tonalities are already very much present at crucial turning points in Pratap's argument, which actually you get better when the text, a lot of things happen in the footnotes and things. So I quote, in relation to the self, a crucial part of Pratap's procedure on Iqbal, the idea that infinity is not an experience of extension, but intensity preserves the individuality of selves. So intensity. Or a page later, for Iqbal, taqdeer, or what the Quran describes as destiny, is not predetermination. It is rather the claim that time is an organic whole in which the past is not left behind but is moving along with and operating in the present. This is Bergson word for word, and it's quoting creative evolution. Similarly, Pratap's emphasis on the idea of ishq in Iqbal, not as love but as intuition, ranked higher than intelligence, is again very directly a Bergsonian insight. The entry of Bergson more explicitly into Pratap's argument is not simply a philosophical technicality, I think. It would reshape the consequences of the argument. Since Pratap is a political theorist, I'll end by offering 3 political consequences of reanimating Iqbal through Nietzsche and Bergson together. Because time is running out, I'll offer the 3 points in short, just as suggestions. First, as a point of orientation, we might say that Iqbal, like many other leading South Asian thinkers and philosophers of the time, is outlining a concept. The core of his philosophy is also to outline a concept of Swaraj, or self-rule. Swa means self, or the sovereignty of the self, which doesn't hinge only on this or that ruler or who happens to be in power. For Iqbal's generation of thinkers, it was clear freedom doesn't end with the question of who is in power. It's a question of how the self strives to be free through forms of becoming in a Nietzschean and Bergsonian sense. And how do we name the quality of the self, that aspect of the self that strives, that remains distinct and yet related to the whole? A lot happens if we call it élan vital, not only for Bergson but also for Nietzsche and for Iqbal. For an affectionate reader of Nietzsche, a very affectionate reader as I am, it's always disappointing to see him caricatured, as he easily is, and Pratap doesn't do that, but many people do, by calling him an aristocratic individualist. For Nietzsche, richness or nobility, as he calls it, is not at all about wealth and not at all about lineage. Sovereigns and subalterns alike, rich and poor, can express what Nietzsche calls slave morality or ressentiment. What Nietzsche was interested in also was not individuals necessarily, but something that can be better understood after Bergson, after Deleuze. It's precisely an experience of intensities, as Pratap calls it, an affirmation of life, to use Deleuze and Professor Reginster's terms, life in the specific sense of élan vital. And who might experience these intensities? According to Iqbal, this doesn't necessarily follow from being a member of this or that religion. Here is Iqbal in the Javednama, one of his famous poems. I quote the couplet. An infidel sitting before an idol, alive at heart, is better than a Muslim asleep in the holy shrine. To rephrase such awakenings in a more secularized or in a Marxist idiom, we could say that Iqbal is interested in what the non-alienated individual might look like in modern life. And while Iqbal's negations often have a Nietzschean coloring, his affirmations, we might say, are more Bergsonian in tone. Navida Khan has drawn out the political significance. Navida Khan has drawn out the political significance of Iqbal's idea of Swaraj, if we can call it that, of the self as involved in the task of, and this is what Navida calls it, constitutional amending, of working on one's own constitution, that is to say the self, as a way to effect a change in the body politic. This is not a theory of self-sufficient individuals, because the self precisely is never sufficient. If these metaphysical speculations seem obscure to us today, which they may indeed to many people, then that obscurity is itself worth pondering, because with Iqbal we are in a generation for whom the question of what it means or what it meant to be free was a question of life and death. And freedom was not only a political but also a metaphysical issue. And if this is not the case today, then how exactly did this happen? And what disappeared when freedom became only a question of redistribution and of capacities? Capacities for what, Iqbal and others would ask. I'll end by thanking Pratap once again for bringing us closer to these questions to whatever extent we are able to receive them today, and for keeping alive the vita contemplativa, as Bergson would call it, in ways that can't be judged solely by immediate use value, as we are often pressurized to do today. Thank you.
Our next commentator, Bernard Reginster, chair of the philosophy department here at Brown. He has been in this university since 1994. His research has focused mostly on issues in ethics, metaphysics, and moral psychology in the 19th century German philosophy. And he's published a number of articles on Nietzsche and on 19th century ethics. His book, The Affirmation of Life, published in 2006 by Harvard University Press, offers a comprehensive interpretation of Nietzsche's ethical thought. Bhanu.
Thank you. Well, let me first express my gratitude to our wonderful and tantalizing lecture, to Professor Mehta for his tantalizing and wonderful lecture, and also to Leela for our kind invitation for me to take part in the discussion here. So Professor Mehta's lecture engages with a wealth of interesting ideas, nearly all of which, as he points out, resonate with themes in the philosophy of Nietzsche, the relationship between philosophical views and psychological needs, the notions of weakness and strength, the various forms of toleration, the use of religious or metaphysical belief as psychological props, the problem of nihilism, the concept of what he calls the divine vice regent as an alternative for Nietzsche's metaphor of the child, and many, many more. Obviously, I cannot address all of them here today, so I will focus my brief remarks on one particular idea which is introduced early on in the lecture and looks to me to be central to the argument of the entire paper. And this is the idea that ethical and even metaphysical views ought to be assessed not in terms of their truth, but in terms of their psychological function. According to Professor Mehta, this idea lies at the heart of Iqbal's critique of the Sufi ethic of what he calls self-abnegation or withdrawal from the world. Now, in Iqbal's view, the problem with this and other similar ethical outlooks is, and this is a quote, not that they are wrong in some objective sense, it is that they are weak. Now, note that this critique has two different aspects. First, it involves what I take to be a purely descriptive claim about the causal history of this ethic of self-abnegation, an account of how it emerged. So this is a quote from the version of Professor Mehta's paper I read. The desire for self-abnegation, he says, must be seen as stemming from a loss of mastery over the world. Now, the second aspect of critique is that it involves a prescriptive claim. The very fact that the ethic of self-abnegation is born from weakness is presented to us as a reason to reject it. Now, Iqbal's justification for this prescriptive claim is a little hard to discern. This is actually going to be the main point I will want to make here. What we're told is that it has to do with the need for, quote, creators of value who can put their stamp on history. Now, in any event, the overall shape of Iqbal's critique is clear. The problem with the Sufi ethic of self-abnegation is not that it is based on false beliefs, but rather that it plays a harmful role. As Professor Mehta puts it, it enfeebles Islam. So what I propose to do is to just take a closer look at these two claims that frame Iqbal's critique. So let's begin with the descriptive claim, namely that the Sufi ethic of self-abnegation is an invention which is designed to serve a certain psychological need. Now, since this ethic is presented to us as, quote, stemming from a loss of mastery over the world, the need that it is intended to serve is presumably a need for mastery over the world. You know, the need for a sense of control over your circumstances, or for what Nietzsche calls a feeling of power. Now, how does valuing self-abnegation serve such a need? Okay, that's my first question. The mastery of the world is presumably a function of our strength and weakness, which are terms Professor Mehta makes use of. It is in virtue of our strength that we acquire mastery, and it is in virtue of our weakness that we lose it. But these notions have in themselves no determinate content. So if I simply enjoin you to master the world or to develop your strength, I do not succeed in giving you a concrete, determined instruction about what you're supposed to do. And this, I think, is because what counts as mastering the world depends on what you value or what you care about. It depends on how you want the world to be or on how you believe the world should be. So if I do not care about climbing Everest, my inability to do so will not count as weakness, and it will not be experienced as weakness by me. And if I do not value wealth, I will likewise not experience my inability to make money as weakness, and my poverty or my relative lack of wealth will not strike me as a lack of mastery over the world. So to experience a loss of mastery over the world, then, I must value certain goals and come to believe that I lack the strength that is necessary to achieve them. This leaves me saddled with what Nietzsche calls a feeling of impotence. My unfulfilled need for mastery may then motivate me to alter my values. Specifically, it may induce me to adopt values that I am strong enough to realize, and therefore values the pursuit of which can restore my injured feeling of power. Now, the Sufi ethic of self-abnegation would be the product of such a revaluation of values. That would be the descriptive claim. The Sufi metaphysician would come to believe that he lacks the strength necessary to make much of a difference in the world, or, to use Professor Mehta's phrase, to put his creative stamp on history. And he would, as a consequence, be induced to embrace an ethic of self-abnegation or withdrawal from the world. From the perspective of this ethic, his inability to make a difference of the world or to make a mark on history would no longer count and would no longer be experienced as weakness, as a lack of mastery. So this is a way of clarifying the descriptive claim. Now let's turn to the second aspect of Iqbal's critique, the prescriptive claim that the Sufi ethic of self-abnegation should be rejected precisely because it is born from weakness. Now, first, the problem for Iqbal is not that Sufi ethical beliefs are epistemically defective because they were formed in the way that I just described. After all, that it makes me feel powerful is not an epistemically relevant reason to adopt a belief, since evoking such feelings has nothing to do with the truth of the belief. The problem with the Sufi ethic for Iqbal is not epistemic, it is functional. Sufi ethic, he says, harms or enfeebles Islam, specifically by discouraging the development of what Professor Mehta calls true creators of value who can put their stamp on history. Now, Professor Mehta doesn't really describe, in this paper in any case, the character of the ethic with which Iqbal proposes to replace the Sufi ethic of self-abnegation, but the emphasis on putting a stamp on history suggests that it is what I'm going to call an ethic of world engagement, in contrast to the Sufi ethic of world withdrawal that is implied by the idea of self-abnegation. I shall therefore refer to Iqbal's own values as an ethic of engagement, or world engagement. Now, Iqbal argues that the ethic of self-abnegation should be abandoned because it is weak, because it enfeebles Islam. But does it? Note first that from the Sufi perspective, self-abnegation is not weakness. On the contrary, it is an expression of strength. From this perspective, mastering the world is nothing over and above than mastering one's own desires, one's own worldly desires, which is what self-abnegation consists of. Perhaps Iqbal's objection is not that self-abnegation is not an expression, that self-abnegation is not an expression of real strength, but only make-believe or pretend strength. But this doesn't strike me as plausible for two reasons. First, as I noted, what counts as strength depends on what one values. Iqbal can therefore not suppose that the ability to realize engagement values is not real strength. Okay, so if strength is indexed, what counts as strength is indexed to your values, you cannot say that what counts as strength from the perspective of the values is not real strength. But there's another point that I want to make here, is that the simple fact that self-abnegation itself is undeniably hard. It takes a genuine kind of strength to withdraw from the world. So the problem with self-abnegation then cannot be that it replaces real strength with merely apparent strength and so fails to fulfill the need for mastery. So that won't work. Perhaps Iqbal supposes that those who subscribe to the Sufi ethic of self-abnegation are deep down, in fact, committed to his ethic of engagement, and they don't recognize it, and his psychological account of the origin of Sufi ethic would be intended to bring this to light. that even those who subscribe to Sufi ethic, deep down, in fact, are committed to the kind of ethic that Iqbal advocates, the ethic of engagement. It is only because they lack the kind of strength required to realize engagement values, to leave a mark of history, for example, and cannot tolerate the resulting feeling of impotence, that they self-deceptively abandon these values and adopt an ethic of self-abnegation instead. In other words, Iqbal's claim that a certain kind of weakness motivates the invention of Sufi ethic of self-abnegation would be meant to show that those who subscribe to this ethic, in fact, deep down, endorse the very engagement values for which he advocates. Now, for this work of argument, for this form of argument to work, however, Iqbal would have to show that the Sufi ethic of self-abnegation was, as a matter of historical fact, an invention of weakness designed to make the weak feel strong again. He would have to rule out that this ethic was instead motivated by the discovery of genuine metaphysical and ethical truth. But as Professor Mehta suggests, Iqbal leaves this issue unresolved. And I quote from Professor Mehta's lecture, "The tension between the representational claims of theology, of Sufi theology, and its functional one is never fully resolved in Iqbal." Okay, so maybe now Iqbal might simply try to bypass this difficulty by noting that even if Sufi self-abnegation was initially an ethic based on the discovery of metaphysical and ethical truth, it could be that it now functions, or it can function psychologically as he describes. After all, a given belief could be true and at the same time be recruited to play a specific functional role in the psychology of the agent who holds it. For instance, my feeling guilty on some occasion may be based on my correct belief that I have willfully violated a moral norm, and at the same time, to borrow a famous Freudian idea, be used by me to vent inward on myself aggression that I can no longer vent outward. But whether Sufi self-abnegation plays the psychological role Iqbal attributes to it in all, or perhaps most cases, is an open question, and one, I believe, which is virtually impossible to answer. Now, moreover, even if the Sufi ethic of self-abnegation is at its historical origin an invention of weakness, it doesn't follow that this is how it still functions by the time Iqbal criticizes it. After all, those who at that time subscribed to this ethic of self-abnegation likely have never endorsed or heard of the values for which Iqbal advocates, the engagement values. Okay? And then, having recognized their inability to realize them, pretended to abandon them to restore their sense of strength and mastery or their feeling of power. Simply, they adopted the Sufi values because these are the values they learned from their parents, their clergy, or their culture in general. The need for mastery had nothing to do with it. So, let me conclude. As Professor Mehta notes, and I quote, Iqbal remained of the firm belief that true creative individuality had to work on the raw material of history, not escape from it. Okay? Now, presumably, this refers to an ethic of engagement in the world, as I pointed out, rather than withdrawal from it. Now, it is no doubt a firm belief, a conviction on Iqbal's part. My question for Professor Mehta is this: is it anything more than this? Is it a claim for which Iqbal has offered decisive arguments, which even the Sufi metaphysician ought to accept? Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I draw some of the discussion or direct some of the discussion towards political theory, that part of Jeremy Waldron. We've had an extensive political philosophy discussion here about values, about self-abnegation, psychological functions of metaphysics, etc., etc. But it's also known that that Iqbal was the philosopher of Pakistan, where the idea of Pakistan as an independent entity, or as an entity belonging, even if part of India, as an entity representing Muslim aspirations, right? that idea, many would argue, was not born in Sir Syed, but born in Iqbal's thought. So may I direct you towards that, partly also for an instrumental reason, not simply for Jeremy Waldron reason. That is that some of the students of my class are here, they're writing this week an essay on the birth of Pakistan. All right. And they want to see what is the connection between Iqbal, Jinnah, Pakistan, and also Azad. So they've read all that. So may I invite you, therefore, while you respond to Bhanu and Bernard, on what philosophical / metaphysical / any other deeper basis the justification of Pakistan was given, A, and B, in what ways is it different from Jinnah's justification of Pakistan, or is it similar to? And thirdly, what would Iqbal say to Maulana Azad's argument that Islam and Hinduism are two different religions, but they can easily live in one nation called India, and you don't need a separate political entity for satisfying Muslim aspirations, either spiritual, cultural, or political? So maybe, yeah. And then we'll open up.
Thanks. I mean, the discussants was such a treat, and they should have given the lecture, actually. I think they both kind of articulated what I was trying to say much better than I ever could have, and opened up all kinds of questions. I mean, I can't take up sort of all the questions. So maybe I'll just pick on one or 2 points. I think to Brigu's point about Bergson, that's absolutely right. I mean, both in textual and historical terms, he is the thinker with whom Iqbal engages most extensively, and we have forgotten what a big presence he was in the early part of the 20th century. And I think it would certainly change, I think, the substantive texture of the argument. I think, in a way, the way I was coming at it, it was, in a sense, trying to establish the importance of those Nietzschean moves in creating a certain kind of rupture. What happens after, I think, has been left unsaid. But absolutely take on board your idea. I think your truly remarkable sort of account of I think the dialectic also in mastery and abdication. I'll give 2 preliminary responses, I think, and I would emphasize that I think they are preliminary. So one, I think, which is just as I think a matter of fact, which I think is you might say an interesting absence in Iqbal, is you actually don't, I mean, for somebody who talks about the inner depths of the self as much as he does, you actually don't have as elaborate a construction of the civil war inside the soul as you might in Plato and Nietzsche, which in a sense goes to your question about, when is abnegation, when is it actually mastery? What are the ways in which we disguise our own motives to ourselves? In that sense, he's not as, we might say, acute a moral psychologist as in a sense Nietzsche is. You might say that the engagement with the inner ocean of the self ends up being a little bit more metaphysical and psychological, despite his thing. So you can actually never quite get to this the very specific question you asked, in a sense, about because there are in a sense 2 ways of revaluing the values, which is, one is to say, okay, by what yardstick does self-abnegation look as weakness, right? You can have an external yardstick of value, or you could actually possibly have a psychological account that actually shows the ways in which you disguise your own motives in being able to actually engage in something. And I'm not sure Iqbal has actually much of the second kind of theory. Does Iqbal, in a sense, have a theory of value that would allow him to argue into the position that other things being equal in some senses, there is something more worthy about self-mastery, about world mastery and world engagement than there is about self-application. I think there are two elements to an answer. One element to an answer is, I think, straightforwardly that engagement with the world is one way of, in a sense, ensuring that what you are not doing is disguising your own motives to yourselves. Right? I mean that there is something about kind of the sheer facticity of that engagement, right? Which perhaps is some kind of inoculation against the idea, right? That you're not simply in a sense kind of running away. So there is some notion of, I guess, accepting that facticity, accepting being thrown into this world, where the lack of engagement seems to be straightforwardly just an act of denial rather than an act of mastery, right? So which is why, in a sense, the two categories that are important for him are both nature and history, right? That in some senses there is a self, but the self is also situated in a body. It is in a sense engaged. And any doctrine of mastery that seems to deny that embodiment or that individuation at a particular moment, it's highly likely that it is engaging in a form of kind of illusory politics. It's a self-denial at an intellectual level. I think that's one. I don't think beyond that he has a kind of positive affirmation of, why are the things being equal? Is the project of mastery understood this way? Important. You might say, if you're being sympathetic, that essentially it comes out of his kind of using prophecy as an exemplar, right? So what is an exemplar of a good life to lead? Muhammad as a kind of prophecy, a divinity that we can all but I don't think there's an argument of that kind. And I think it's an interesting question whether on his premises you can actually even begin to give that argument. But I think it's that negative construction that disengagement on the surface is more likely to rest on some denial of obvious facts, which you could sort of, which you should take on board if you're being genuinely creative rather than just running away from the world. Ashu's big question.
My students are waiting for your answer.
So let me, I think, say this way. So here's a nice line actually that Naveda Khan uses about Iqbal in Pakistan, which I think has something to recommend to it, which is that Pakistan was the consequences of his words, if not the consequences of his thought. Something to that effect. I'm not getting the exact quote right? The point, I think, and this is, I think, a general methodological point now about looking back at political debates in that period, which is, at one level, nobody got what they wanted, right? And I think we too often easily assume that the outcome that we saw in the partition, right, its seeds must have been kind of irrevocably contained, right, in some ideological doctrine or idea that justifies it, right? My own way of kind of carving out, I think that debate now is very different. I don't think this debate over partition can be looked at only if you confine it to the question of territorial partition, right? So think of 4 or 5 different options you have, right? In terms of, the political landscape at the time, right? There is the American-style democratic option, right? Constitution, equal rights to all individuals, one person, one vote. Your political rights become totally independent of your religious identities, right? There's a detachment of identity in citizenship. Why does this solution not work? Not only does the solution not work, this is the solution that is consistently classed as the communal solution, right? The American solution would have been the communal solution in the Indian context. Why doesn't it work? Because of the standard John Stuart Mill problem. Democracy, you count heads. If you count heads, and there are permanent majorities and minorities. Majorities may, the problem of Hindu-Muslim problem becomes a problem in the context of electoral democracy, right? In the context of universal suffrage, right? Even in as early as Sayyid Ahmad Khan, chapter 16 of John, right? So then you say, well, but won't equal rights be a solution to that? Well, the answer is, who's going to enforce those equal rights, right? Right? So you need some degree of representation that protects against that, right? And that's where from
In institutions of power.
in institutions of power, from 1905 to 1947, you actually don't get a resolution to that problem. If you deviate from that standard American principle, the right says this is giving minorities a veto on conceptions of common citizenship or something, right? You're giving them power out of proportion to their numbers, right? If you don't give them that veto, right, they say we are not well protected. And the fact is, if you just model it, every single negotiation, there was never a stable representational institutional solution to that conundrum. And in fact, most democracies have not evolved one, to be honest, right? So that's the problem in the context of representation, which is largely what Jinnah is, right, interested. Now, it's a moot question whether, you want territorial partition or not, but the question is, did you have a solution to that specific problem of representation, right?
Is Iqbal, may I interrupt? Is Iqbal addressing that question through philosophical reasoning?
Not the democratic question as much. Iqbal's question is slightly different. So there's the axis of representation, right? There's a second axis, which is the axis of, you might say, religious identity. So let me offer you two different possibilities, right? And what would you have done in the 1930s? One says you can keep India territorially united, but the consequence of keeping India territorially united is that both communities, right, Hindus, Muslims, you're just using them as a placeholders here, the socially orthodox elements in those communities, right, will be able to police the boundaries of law so that they retain their identities as distinct communities. Because one of the paradoxes is that every single, and Ambedkar saw this very clearly. Ambedkar's essay on Pakistan is, sees the logic, is the price of a united India was actually going to be to empower the socially orthodox in all communities, right? Because united India was going to be premised on, we forget that fact, there were going to be two separate systems of laws. So there's no territorial partition, but there is a partition of the legal and citizenship discourse that actually underwrites it, right? Right? It's an interesting question if you're somebody like Jawaharlal Nehru in the 1930s and 1940s, right? Do you see this constitutional project as a transformative project liberating individuals from the clutches of religious identity, right? And accept partition? Or do you say this territorial unity is sacred? We are willing to live with, a community being governed by Sharia and be governed by something else, because that would have been the natural consequence, right? Right? So, looked at it from that angle, actually Azad's position turns out to be a much more conservative position. It's territorial unity because, right? It will actually produce social conservatism of a certain kind. And it's not an accident, right? Whether it was Deoband or a whole range of schools, right, that were arguing for territorial unity, right? Arguing territorial unity on the basis of this, in a sense, on the basis of this contract, right? So that's a second. Iqbal's, I think, is more fuzzy in some ways. I think it's more fuzzy in the sense that at one level, metaphysically, he does seem to have sort of, I think, two different ideas running together. One, that if you actually had something like a modern Muslim political community in place, it could be the locus of a new regeneration of and modernization of Islam, right? So it's kind of Turkey and Pakistan are the two sort of possible sort of options, right? And you need it to be in a sense a separate state because it is the instrument of that Islamic sort of, regeneration, right? It can't be just a kind of minority sort of. He also paradoxically thought that that actually liberates the Hindus to modernize as well. I mean, in some senses, it's in fact, what's striking about Iqbal is that he actually, metaphysically, he likes partitions, right? Because what partitions do away with is, I think, and in that sense, he's not a liberal. He was never a liberal, even though he has a strong conception of toleration, is that they do away with this messy politics of plurality, right? And one of the reasons I think he wants to do away with the messy politics of plurality has in part to do with his metaphysical commitments, right? Because the only way the messy politics of plurality works in a liberal context is by creating these legal distinctions between the religious and the secular, right? But that is I mean, in that sense, you might say he's post-Nietzschean, he's post-Marxist, actually, right? I mean, that is actually the very dualism that throws us back into, right? This idea of two realms that he actually wants to overcome. So if you want to think of an ethical community where of perfectible beings, each striving towards their, the best perfection they can, in a sense, attain, part of the condition of that community is actually, in a sense, kind of effacing the distinction between the religious and the secular. The only practical way of doing it, in the context where you actually have different religious communities, is to actually have each of those communities form that kind of a metaphysical community, right? So, and in that sense, there's no contradiction, in a sense, between, his at one level, his kind of seamless appropriation of, all metaphysical traditions, as Brigo was sort of talking about, right? But the question is, what's the objective form? What objective form would the instantiation of that idea of actually perfection take in a community? And I don't think he ever actually got a kind of answer sort of to that. But what it did do was provide that central argument, right? That a new kind of Muslim state, right, located in India, right, could be, in a sense, the forerunner of a wider, progressive, new kind of Islam, right? That you'd have to instantiate that state somewhere, and India seemed the most likely candidate where you could actually instantiate that state, right? So there's no neat resolution to this partition question in some ways. I mean, I think we've oversimplified it by focusing just on the question of, do you want to stay in the same territory, right? Which is not the same question as what system of representation can accommodate you, which is not the same question as what system of laws can accommodate that coexistence. And it's not the same question ultimately that you, in a sense, find in Iqbal, which is, given that the modern state in the Hegelian sense has not turned out to be the realization of the absolute, what form of political community, right, best actually realizes this community of perfectible beings. But the one thing Iqbal was clear on, whatever it is a community that will have to erase the standard liberal distinction between the religious and the secular.
So could we say then that at least one stream of thought here is that for a modern Muslim to live soulfully and authentically, and to modern for the individual to realize a more perfect being, a separate modern Muslim community was necessary.
I mean, he certainly makes that argument. He
there
does
is
make
that argument.
that argument is there, absolutely. Yeah.
Right? And that soulful living, striving for greater perfection, is not possible in the kind of proposals that were emerging
Yeah. I mean,
about United India. About United India.
Yeah. So now that's the added complication, right? So because all turns on this word community, right? Whether it's, and certainly it's not a nation state, right? But I mean, I think the larger challenge, right, in a sense, which is, I think, just again an interesting historiographical point, which is, in the maybe 1900 to 1920, 1930s, there is still a kind of strange imagining of all kinds of different political forms, right? And I think the interesting question is, why do almost all forms of modern political community end up aspiring to be or looking like nation states, right? Despite the fact that there's a whole kind of imagining of different kinds of alternatives, right? I mean, is there something about the momentum of, in a sense, politics and economics and history, right, that all of these other possible political forms that you could actually imagine, right, in a sense, end up looking one way or the other like nation states? I think that's the interesting question.
Okay, so we have up to 8 minutes or so for an open conversation. This was dominated too much by this side, so let's turn to you and your wisdom and your insights to take the conversation further. Yeah, Karuna.
Thank you. That was really an inspiring panel. And
To introduce Karuna, Karuna Mantana is a professor of political theory at Yale, and thank you for your visit. Yeah.
I don't think this can be answered, but I think I wanted to ask two questions, and it's really to anyone who wants to. It's really thinking about the difference of the relationship between self and what is around self, and the three terms that I saw, and I think in Iqbal seem to be simultaneous: differentiating the self, creating the self, and preserving the self. But I guess I'm curious if it matters, which of the emphasis that you put on, and preservation and creation we can see out of the Nietzschean universe, but differentiation is also seems to push from a certain Eastern metaphysic. And so I'm curious about that boundary, and I think one thing it made me think that something that might be important there is maybe differentiating not just what the underlying ontology of the self is, but maybe in this particular period, the late 19th century, what that sense of the pressure of the outside is. There's the metaphysical understanding of that, whether it's nature, history, or time. But obviously Emerson to Nietzsche to Gandhi, and it is modern mass democracy of some kind. So I'm just curious if you had some sense of what you think in Iqbal that the pressure might be, or if there's another name for it, of what the individual is constantly working against. Because absorption is the metaphor, but absorption into what exactly? And it seems interesting to see what that different. And the other, which I guess it was more out of the second set of comments, and it does seem to me, at least in Reconstruction, and I don't know Iqbal's other works well, that there is a cognitive. I mean, I guess I'm curious what the debate in some sense that we were having was partially that this is a functional defense and there isn't an epistemic character to it, but it seemed like Iqbal's part of Iqbal's claim seems to be that there is the turning intensity to subjective experience is also not just value is connected to some sense of an objective truth, which is experiential but cognitive. And so I guess I don't know what that is exactly, but it does seem that it is trying to keep truth at play and not get absorbed into pure subjectivity, and that's the real crisis of inwardness or self-abnegation, is losing losing values but losing objectivity.
Rajiv?
I think it's more or less been covered.
Your point has been covered by Karuna?
More or less, in a better way.
Okay. Any other thought? Okay, Pratap.
So, that's a, because so let me kind of go to a limb here and suggest, I think, something that may be going on, which makes, so you're right that, one of the words he uses a lot is experience, right? Which also has a kind of cognitive and facticity content to it. So it's not stuff you sing out kind of make up, right? I mean, this is, and the one thing he's consistent about, right, is I don't want to deny the reality of that experience, anything, whether it's mystical, whether it's that there is something in that intensity, and you could actually argue in some senses, experience works as the kind of correlate of what happiness might work in a kind of classical philosophical sense, which is just being in a state of being that self-evidently, right, a sort of, brings forth this kind of own veridical self-justification, right? I think the difficulty he has, and this I think, I mean, this I'm going to briefly touch on Friday actually, because it comes up even more in Aurobindo, is I think he has to talk about this idea of experience at a moment in that cultural crisis where you don't have a vocabulary left in which to actually talk about it, right? So one of the things that in a sense happens with I mean the way I kind of flippantly sort of say is that, using that chapter from Alistair McIntyre's kind of, fragmented vocabularies, but think of this different analogy, which is, suppose you got a bunch of philosophy of science texts, right? Lots of different schools, realism, anti-realism, constructivism, whole range of philosophy of science texts, right? But you had no conception what scientific practice was like. I mean, what is it that these texts refer to, right? I mean, right? And out of these philosophy of science texts, you then try and construct a whole bunch of disputes, right? There's a realist school, there's an anti-realist school, without, in a sense, having the sense of what these ontological reference actually might be. What is this dispute actually about, right? And I mean, I think part of what actually, in a sense, happens to Indian intellectual history at that moment, right? And, I mean, this is an interesting question of the privacy of experience in that sense, is that the philosophical argument, right, in a sense gets sundered away from that experiential sort of reality, right? So, I mean, it just becomes, I mean, Aurobindo kind of struggles it all the scholars who write on him struggle. Even with Iqbal, you have actually this sort of issue when he says, I believe in this mystical experience. What is it that I actually believe, right? We all proceed, what we do is we kind of just put that aside and then firmly go on to sort of look at that philosophical, right? At a slightly minor level, you have a kind of similar problem in the use of experience in German sociology and German philosophy, right? From Simmel and Weber, right? So this is experience. What, I mean, what is this thing, right? Right? In a way that is actually rationally communicable and intersubjectively shared, right? So part of, I think, the difficulty is that although there is something like the move that you are actually describing, it's not a move that actually then gets connected up to representation in a rational system of thought, right? Or they have great difficulty doing it within the conceptual categories that in a sense they are actually deploying. So it just becomes more obscure, perhaps, than they intended to be.
You want to say something? Sure.
I'll take a shot at least what lies outside the stack, but just to clarify, I mean, there should be no confusion about it. Nation state is not Iqbal's idea.
Yeah.
He's a Nietzschean, distrusts the nation state as the answer to anything.
Yeah.
But the complexity of it is that the idea that Iqbal sets out the aspiration for what a community of Muslims might be, that is appropriated quite strongly
By the Pakistan movement.
Yeah. So, but in Iqbal himself, the idea is not at all attached to nation states. What lies outside the self, I think on this issue, as I see it, Iqbal is quite systematic and basically suggests two concepts which are central to his work, because what he's trying to do, as Pratap is very correctly pointing out in the argument against metaphysics, is it's not the end of metaphysics. It's basically metaphysics bifurcates into two problems, both of which, as I see it, he gets then the answer from Bergson, one being intensity, the second being duration, the problem that he's totally obsessed with, and basically is a region that is not unlike the problem that many philosophers were in, being and time. What is the relationship between those? So his basic thing is to take it in these two directions, as I see it, so that what lies outside the self is not infinity, but is its relationship to intensity and to duration.
Bernard, would you like to?
Yes, I just had a thought as I was listening to you. So the need for mastery is a very fundamental need. It's a need that needs to be addressed, because if it goes unfulfilled, it creates an atmosphere of compression, psychological compression that might undercut the ability to have the kind of intensity of experience to which you are alluding. In fact, arguably, the kind of ethical outlooks of self-abnegation and world withdrawals are designed as ways to give individuals a kind of a locale in which they can have intense experiences, because those experiences are just deeply inhibited any place else, right? So this is the first point. The second point, I would, in general, and going back to what you were saying earlier, it's important to note that the need for so if you're going to diagnose, say, Sufi ethics of self-abnegation in terms of the need for self-mastery, you should also look at it. You should also look at the ethics of engagement in the same terms, because there's room there for perversions as well, right? Yeah. So you were saying that an ethic of engagement is less likely to involve a self-deception about your motives, but it can promote it, right? So I couldn't help but thinking about I don't know what the phrase is going to be, Trumpist or Trumpian. This is an ethics of engagement in the material world that rests on a fantasy of omnipotence of some kind, right? Which is equally as pathological as.
It's time to bring this session to an end and pick up the threads again on Friday. So, on behalf of all of us, let me thank Pratap, Brigu, and Bernard for wonderful reflection, stimulating thought, and for enriching us all. Thank you very much.